And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. It's great to have on today Laura Hanford. Laura, how are you today?
I'm doing well. It's great to be with you, Josh.
And so, met Laura at a conference earlier this year. I was just really blessed by her work, both on international religious freedom, but also on parental rights, which is going to be the topic of this episode. We're going to be talking about a growing assault on parental rights. I truly believe every Christian parent, every Christian grandparent, ministry leader needs to know what is going on, and perhaps most importantly, what can be done about it. And so I'm so grateful to have her expertise here to talk with us about that. So Laura is a contributor to a number of various publications, but is also currently serving as a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation, speaking specifically about parental rights. She's a mother of five, actively involved in school policy, also religious freedom issues in Virginia. She served from 2015 to 2018 on Fairfax County Public Schools, I think I'll get this right, Family Life Education Curriculum Advisory Committee, a committee really dealing with sex ed. She was also the lead congressional staff drafter of the International Religious Freedom Act, we'll get that right too, of 1998, and we'll get into that story. She also served at the U.S. Embassy in Romania as the officer in charge of human rights and a graduate of Princeton University. Laura, I may have missed some things in your bio, but anything that I might have missed, but also maybe just a recent story, some success in your work.
Sure. No, that's a pretty good list there. Um, I think just big picture, one of the highlights of the work that I'm involved with now, which especially has to do with child protection issues around gender ideology at a state level, sometimes internationally. But I think one of the things that I really enjoy is that it has brought together a coalition of people from so many different backgrounds. It's not just Christians and conservatives that are worried about this. It's a whole range of, like, I have a friend on the West Coast who moved to San Francisco on purpose because it's progressive, but whose child got pulled into this and who's since become quite an activist. And we might have completely different views on everything from abortion to to any kind of other sort of lifestyle issues. And yet on this issue, I find that parents and advocates for them are willing to give up a lot of the lives and the success that they have in order to focus on protecting their children. And that's just across the spectrum, because all of us love our kids. It's not just that's not something that's isolated to one religion or another. I would say in terms of like a success story or somewhere where I think we've made a difference recently is a bill in Virginia that was going to give sole accreditation power to a group that oversees centers around the country that deal with child abuse. So this one was specific to Virginia. But it's a group that an accreditation process that is very strongly pro gender affirming. And so if that group has sole accreditation, then they're able to drive the agenda on which abuse centers get approved. And after learning about some of what we had found out in terms of what this organization was promoting, the Virginia bill, specifically the Youngkin administration, was able to modify that somewhat so that it doesn't give so much power to that organization to push this agenda. So that's it seems very arcane, but I think what people don't realize is that these issues of accreditation and curriculum and training have been in play for decades now, and that in the social and educational and legal fields, increasingly, there's a predominant view now that to not affirm a child is abuse. And so that's leading to all kinds of excesses and actually to kids being taken away from their parents. And so that's a big focus for me right now. And there's other things that are in play, but that's a small piece of where we've seen some success.
I want to emphasize 2 points there. One is I have been blessed. I've always been a curious individual. I enjoy meeting different folks from different backgrounds, but our society has kind of differentiated from itself. We kind of go to people that are like us, and we will move even to places where people are like us. And so you don't always have an opportunity to catch a story of somebody that has a different view on things. And in this issue, parental rights specifically, it has been truly remarkable. The folks that, like, you do know what I stand for, right? I don't hide that. They're like, oh yeah, we want to work with you. I'm like, okay, because that's not the case in a lot of other areas. And so it is this really unique opportunity, I think. The other one is
Thank
just
you.
to really put it, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think part of that, and in some respects, it differs from coalitions I've been, especially on religious freedom, that I was a part of in the past. Almost every person that I know that has come to work on this field has paid a price of some sort or has had to take a stand that wasn't popular. And so what you have is this sort of assortment, this very odd bedfellow assortment, but of people that know what it's like to pay a price and that have had the courage to do that. And so there's that draws you together, I think, in a way that for the moment on this issue really transcends party and even views on all kinds of things, even though they might have very strongly held views and I might have very strongly held views in other areas, this is one that we can work together on.
I appreciate that. And the other thing I want to just put an exclamation point behind is this idea that if non-affirmation, so you're just teaching your child what the Bible says about sex, about gender. We're created as immediately male and female. We flourish when we embrace who God created us to be. If you're teaching that, but the state may come in and treat that as abuse, as neglect, and therefore bring the entire machinery of the state child welfare system down on you. And that's what we're talking about. And I hope people sit up a little straighter. Like, this is not theoretical. This is not just happening in one place. This is happening around the country. And why I wanted to have Laura on to just emphasize this for us so that we know what's going on and then we can respond. Now, before we jump into that particular issue, I did want to ask you a little bit about the International Religious Freedom Act, which you are a big part of. And one of the reasons this intrigued me is as I am preaching in churches on Christian citizenship, as I'm talking to folks about their role as citizen, I sometimes get a little bit of a shrug. Well, haven't we lost the culture war? And we can't really do that much good in the world. And so we just don't value our American Christian citizenship. Whereas I see that the United States has tremendous influence in the world. We didn't personally create that, but I do think we're called to steward it. And how would we do that? Well, one of the ways I think is promoting religious freedom around the world. And so you and your husband were right in the middle of creating this unique tool. And so please share a little bit of that story, how that bill came about and how it's being used.
Sure. Um, yes, and I 100% agree with that, that we need to, I mean, it's even biblical, right? Authority is given, government authority is given for good, to exercise just for good. And of course, everyone's definition of good is going to differ. But in this case, my background was growing up I was a missionary kid in France, very apolitical. But after or during college became more, and I was growing up in the era where the Iron Curtain was still there. So I went the last 2 years of school to a little school in Germany, and it was West Germany at the time. My church in France used to smuggle help to the underground church in Eastern Europe. So this was
Oh, wow.
I was fascinated with what goes on the other side. So eventually I ended up studying that area generally and ended up after college on a fellowship with the State Department going to our embassy in Romania, which had only recently where a revolution had only recently happened. And so communism was still very much, and of course it takes generations to get past that, but was still very much influencing things. And so I ended up being given the position of human rights officer. And it was eye-opening. I felt like it was the best job in the embassy because I got to actually look into conditions that were affecting everyone from all the most vulnerable ethnic minorities and women and children, refugees, and realizing, wow, this is a way of helping people's lives. The US government can help. And so I ended up working in Congress for several years, joining a group that had been, or a group of staffers that was working together led by now my husband, John Hanford, who was working on Senator Lugar's staff. So Indiana has something to be really proud of there. And my husband had been interning with Tim Keller when Tim Keller, for probably most of your listeners will know who that is, but when Tim Keller was still preaching at his small blue collar church in Virginia, my husband, after seminary, interned with him. And it was during that time, he used to chase their kids around in the basement. So it was
Wow.
great and really he was such a good a good man, very consistent, somebody with integrity personally and then, publicly. But so my husband started wondering, what about all these nations where there's so many restrictions on religious freedom? Wouldn't there be a way to work through our government so that people have more freedom? The church has more freedom to function. Any religious believer has more freedom to learn about their faith, to practice their faith. And that led to his proposing a partnership or to working with Senator Lugar back in the late 80s and or late 88, 87. And that was the end of the Cold War period. And so the first case that he worked on with Senator Lugar were the last couple hundred prisoners that were Jewish and Pentecostal who were in gulags and imprisoned in various places in the Soviet Union. Because of Senator Lugar's intervention, those prisoners were released. So that made the front page of the New York Times, and it confirmed this idea that why would we not use existing government channels to advocate on behalf of prisoners of faith, or against policies that restrict people from exercising their faith or sharing their faith. So I joined. So he was already working on carefully researching interventions, helping guide the U.S. government, that sort of thing, on how to intervene. We eventually wrote a bill that set up a whole structure within the U.S. government. It was called the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. And it sets up an ambassador at large for international religious freedom. So there's a high-level diplomat to negotiate directly with these countries, an annual report, so that in every embassy around the world, people are discussing these issues and they have to go investigate, which they weren't doing before in many countries. They have to report back not only on what's happening, but on what the US government has done to help. And then there's a mechanism where if there's a certain level of violation, then the country is designated as a country of particular concern, and that kicks off a negotiation period that can end in sanctions or other actions. And that is actually patterned after trade law, where sanctions are the most effective really in trade law rather than other places. But that whole process of having a pending action that's a formalized process is very effective in trade law. So we thought, for the first time, we'll try this in human rights law, and it worked. And then there's various other training provisions, a Commission on International Religious Freedom, various other provisions. But it was a way of institutionalizing, trying to do two things. One, but make sure that our government is doing as much as it can to advance religious freedom. But secondly, to try to establish what are the best levers for change in these other governments. What's the most effective way of pressing for change? And of course, that is not going to look the same in Iraq as Iran, as Saudi Arabia, as Vietnam, as China, as Russia. It's all going to look different. So you have to have enough flexibility built into the law that you have to do something, but you have to do it. You have to find something that's effective in that culture and that particular context and that bilateral relationship.
One thing I want to emphasize from this effort was just, as Christians, sometimes maybe we wonder, what can I do to make a difference in my own zip code or in my state, my nation? Just the story of you and your husband literally helping craft a bill that sets up, an international ambassador for religious freedom, and the reporting levers as well, as to how our country is doing on religious liberty. And especially now with the quickly changing world order. And we had on recently an individual talking about artificial intelligence and some of the challenges that that's going to create for believers all around the world. And Caesar or Stalin could have only dreamed about, gate recognition technology, geofencing phones, and all of that. So I'm just so grateful for your work, and I love that. I think it's a great example of. I love your citizenship, the emphasis there, and then just the story and lesson it gives us of let's be engaged to do something good. So that then brings us to this issue of parental rights. And so what led you to pivot from international religious liberty to parental rights?
So when my husband and I fell in love while working on this bill, we sort of jokingly call it our first baby, because for anyone who's working on legislation, it's not a pleasant process giving birth to a bill, but we really see so many ways God's grace was at work there. But then during President Bush's both of his terms, he appointed my husband to serve as that ambassador. So we were in the unusual position of being able to implement the policy that we had written. I say we because
It's
I was,
amazing.
the
Yeah.
kitchen cabinet and cheering, but and it worked. It was really in many ways. But I went from, so we had 5 kids in pretty quick succession and a lot of other family illnesses and things like that. So I ended up pulling back for quite some time from any official capacity, and went from trying to change countries to changing diapers. And I wouldn't give it up. It was a lot of diapers, but a lot of fun and a lot
Very,
of
very important work for sure. Yeah.
anyways, a lot of years that I would never want to give up. But when what we did with our children have spent the first several years in elementary, and then sometimes and middle school, usually in a wonderful small Christian school, but then they've moved on to the public school. And in 2015, my oldest daughter, moved on to the public system, and we are in Fairfax County, which is one of the largest districts in the country, largest and wealthiest, and one of the most influential because it's because partially proximity to Washington, and it just has disproportionate influence on school boards across the country. They decided they wanted to go hardcore down this path of gender identity and sexual orientation and placing it in policy after policy. And so I got involved with several other moms in protesting. They had lied to and sort of bringing to light what they had said, that they had to make these changes to conform to new standards of learning. That was a complete lie. They lied to the whole county. There was nothing in the new Virginia standards of learning that even had anything to do with gender identity or sexual orientation. But that was just the first of a whole series of measures to get to circumvent parents, essentially. So when that happened, I was asked to serve. We have no board members that I would consider family friendly. At the time, we had 2 out of 10 that were supportive of parents and families. And I was appointed by one of them to serve on the Fairfax County Sex Ed, which is that mouthful of a title that I gave at the beginning, on that committee. And my goal was to, as much as I could, mitigate some of the damage from some of the really terrible things they were teaching. So for 3.5 years, I served on that committee. And there were some successes. I would say there were two or three out of us total, out of 33 or 34, who were what I would consider family friendly on that committee openly. But sometimes I was able to we were able to have some small victories because most of them were there for the coffee and to rubber stamp what the school said. And I knew how to use Robert's Rules of Order from my time on the Hill. And so sometimes I was able to force some votes, like, no, we shouldn't use a shadow reenactment of a rape scene to teach kids about consent. There's nothing good about that and a lot of bad. So, but I think what I learned there was there's a sense in which schools consider themselves, especially schools now, it's not about the writing, the reading, and all that as much as it is about there's this almost messianic sense that they have, or a sense that they are there to enlighten our children into a full understanding and flourishing of their sexuality and of their sense of gender, and that they will do that in every possible way they can and get past parents if that's what it takes. So there's this underlying sense that the more information at earlier ages, the more graphic, the better. And it was serving on that committee was really eye-opening. It was like flipping reality from what is actually good for kids, to things that are where they're actively trying to teach kids things that can be harmful. So
I wanted to emphasize something you said there because I certainly have experienced it, and I still am working my way through it a little bit because you become active in these areas. You're reviewing these materials and just saying like hold on a second, wait a second. You kind of feel like you're the kid yelling, "The emperor has no clothes." Like what are we talking about here? There's this almost secular self-righteousness. I think the term you mentioned is kind of messianic complex. Whereas as a believer, I've generally considered myself to have been promoting moral principles, at times, made a little bit of fun of, like, you're a little Victorian or prudish, to now it being turned on its head to like, you're the sinner, you're the unrighteous because you're blocking us from doing this. And so it is something I think you have to prepare yourself for, to be prayed up as you walk into some of these things, because that was not a place I was used to being. And you'll certainly experience it if you jump in here. So what culminated there on the sex ed board?
So by the time, so 3.5 years in, my purpose, as I said, was to mitigate and bring some level of neutrality or scientific basis to what they were teaching. And they had just included a lot of stuff about gender identity that was completely unscientific, of course. Things like it's internal and, it is who you are, when we know that almost every child will desist, even if they do experience some confusion or distress over gender, if they are supported and just supported through puberty development, then they will not later identify as a member of the other sex, and they won't have all the issues, the medical issues that go along with being transitioned. So, but that's not the orthodoxy. The orthodoxy is what's inside is immutable, and you cut up the outside, or you medicalize the outside to match the inside. And so I made a motion to only use the term sex or biological sex in all the lessons that we had, not the term sex assigned at birth, because it's not assigned and it doesn't happen as at birth. There's not a gender fairy that runs around sprinkling the fairy dust when the child is born and you might get the color wrong. It doesn't work like that. So I made that motion to only use the term biological sex or sex, and also to include a warning, like we do for other kinds of activities. If you engage in sexual activity, you might get this disease, is the way it's phrased in our sex ed. Well, if you transition, then it's an experimental process that might result in unknown complications of various sorts. Well, you would have thought between those two motions, it was like all hell broke loose, kind of literally. But I was fired. So basically, my position, by the time they got rid of me, by the next meeting, they replaced me with a Democratic Party activist, one of the attorneys who had helped push the Boy Scouts to accept homosexual leaders. And so he came in and basically he came in and said biological sex is meaningless. Everyone knows that. There's a consensus. And now they're only using sex assigned at birth throughout the curriculum. And of course, because they had their numbers are overwhelming, they not only voted to do that, but they voted against any kind of roll call that would have showed who was voting for it. And it passed. There were a lot of parents. I had parents praying for me before every meeting. And so word spread very quickly as to what was going on. So they actually had to change the venue for the next couple of meetings because so many parents showed up and were upset about what was going on. We still lost, but we won in the framing of it, because it was even the media, the local media, presented it as parents are worried this is ideological rather than scientific, but we want to support trans kids, was kind of the way it was. So it was a defeat, but it really showed, it just shows the perspective. It really is good masquerading, evil masquerading is good. Telling children, it's entrapping them in this lie that they are, it gives them an easy target. It gives an easy reason. Kids that are uncomfortable in their own skin, it gives them an easy target for an easy answer for why somebody made a mistake. And it's also an external explanation. It's an easy person, something else is to blame. I don't have to do anything. If I can just get people to stop being so mean for me, I will be happy. So it sells these children snake oil, really, that if they do these things, they will then be happy. And of course, we know that it leads to really deadliness and to destruction of not only of the outside, but then the inside too.
I definitely wanted to just emphasize, as you mentioned, the spiritual element here, that parents have the responsibility in Scripture to raise their children according to the nurture and admonition of the Lord. We see this in Genesis 1 about the created order being made immutably male and female. And so there certainly is that element there. And I believe that all of this led to David Platt at McLean Bible Church preaching a sermon on this. Would you explain a little bit of the circumstances
Sure.
surrounding
Yeah, that was a phenomenal sermon. So all this, I had kind of gone in, and I would encourage, even just regular parents of school, if you're involved or not, to go in, to keep your pastor in the loop, keep your pastors in the loop. And I had started going in, once I served on the committee, I had started going in and meeting with a couple of the pastors every so often to let them know what was going on in the school. So it wasn't like I was showing up out of nowhere. But when it came time for school board elections in 2019, that there was so much at stake. I mean, whether you're able to counsel a child from a biblical perspective, whether parents are going to have things hidden from them, which is the way it is now in Fairfax, all those things. So I put together a memo and excerpts from the school board, and my husband and I were asking different churches in our area to speak and to ask people to vote in the school board elections. You don't have to say for whom, but you can say these are the issues at stake. That people have a right
Yeah.
to know that these things will directly impact what you can teach your children, and whether sometimes you can even keep your children. And so, bless him, I got a call, shortly before. So I put together this memo for David Platt, and he read the whole thing. I met with some of the other pastors too and shared it, and all the pastors were in agreement that it was important to preach this. So he scuttled the sermon that he had ready to preach, and preached this beautiful sermon on um, being made in the image of God, and how we all have brokenness in this area, but how as a church we are responsible to know what's going on and to take action in our culture and all. It was just a beautiful sermon, and a real example, I think, of how pastors should take this on. And the thing that I would say, and I said this in the memo to David too, was um, as Christians, sometimes, especially I think definitely in Northern Virginia, so all around the Capitol, churches are so squeamish about saying anything to do with elections. And I think that, and what I said was, I worked for years on cases of people who would have done anything to be able to have a say in the laws that they were suffering from. I mean, Christians in jail, or not just Christians, but Afghan women who stood in line, or Iraqi women who stood in line at great risk to themselves to be able to vote. And here we're squeamish about telling people to go vote. If we can't get activated for something like the image of God being directly attacked in our children being taken away from us, our ability to teach them what scripture says being taken away from us, at what point do we get involved? At what point do we care enough? And so the issue is, you can either care enough to get involved now and exercise your legal right to vote, or you can be down the line deciding whether you're going to engage in civil disobedience or criminal activity to do those things. So if it's not like if you stay neutral and don't do anything, things stay neutral, they don't. So there's no controlling the outcome for sure, but if you decide to not get involved, then you can't complain when down the road the government comes and takes your kid away, because you're not allowed to teach them that a girl's a girl and a boy is a boy.
And I so appreciate. We'll link to David Platt's sermon, and just the way that you handled that. Sending the pastor, not like, pastor, you have to do this or you're a coward. Yeah, that works all the time, right? But just to say, hey, here's what's going on, and of course this is a biblical issue. And I was grateful that he was willing. And I listed the pieces of it, haven't gone through all of it, but certainly the parts about the school board and about being made in the image of God. And yeah, he's like, I was going to preach something else, but God encouraged me to do this. And so I
I was
appreciate.
hoping for a
Yeah,
paragraph. I mean, and he did a whole
yeah.
sermon. So
Yeah.
it
It's
was
about
really,
an
really,
hour too.
and then,
Like
yeah.
sometimes I feel bad if I go for the 35, 40 minutes mark. If you've listened to the podcast for some time, you're like, yeah, I've heard some longer ones, but it's a great sermon. So I just wanted to emphasize that aspect of it. And for Christians, we can have a lot of impact in our own zip code. This is certainly a place to do that. And you've talked about this as like the state could come and get your kids. And I'm sure for a lot of parents, a lot of grandparents, like, really, is that really what's going on? Now, we've talked about the Cox case with Mary and Jeremy, who were raising their son according to his biological sex, providing every need. He declared himself to be transgender. They, of course, according to their beliefs, but also their research, believed it was best to raise him according to his biological sex. The state treated that as neglect. The exact quote was, she, biological male, she should be in a home where she is accepted for who she is. Direct quote from the state. And even after the state dismissed all allegations, he was out of the home for more than 2 years. And so we've shared that example. Laura, you shared a story with me about Sage. It's the woman's first name that just broke my heart. And I don't know why every parent in the country doesn't know about it already. Not a fault of yours, not a fault of necessarily the parents not listening, but of just, we have to kind of tamp these stories down. So would share with us what happened with Sage.
Sure. So this is a story that happened in Virginia. And ironically, sadly, um, Sage's adoptive mother had moved from the Northeast, I think from Massachusetts, to Appomattox, Virginia, because that's a conservative area. And she figured this was a better place to protect her child from some of the threats of these kinds of ideologies being taught. Um, so she, to provide a little bit of context, the previous governor, Governor Northam in Virginia, who's also the governor that said that if babies are born alive from an abortion, we'll just keep them comfortable and decide what to do with them. That same governor passed a policy saying that schools could keep gender transition secret from parents. So if a child says that they're transgender and they don't want to tell the parents, so school respects that, doesn't tell the parents that they are now proceeding to transition the child to a new name, new pronouns. They bring in a whole support team around the child. They have a whole plan written out, a gender support plan, and this can go on for years. Potentially, I have a friend to whom one of her classmates has happened. The mother was in an award ceremony here in Fairfax area, and the name was the wrong name. She thought, well, who's, let's say Henry. And it turned out that was her daughter who was being treated by the school and had been for a long time as a boy, and she had no idea. So that can happen. And then at age 18, the child can go and spend a half hour at Planned Parenthood and get hormones and transition medically. And the parents will have been kept out of this vital aspect of their child's mental health for years, potentially. So in Virginia, um, during that time, Sage was 14. So Sage's mother's name is Michelle. Sage was 14, little ninth grader, freshman starting up new. Sage was already a child who had suffered a lot of trauma as an infant. Her father had died, and her biological grandmother adopted her, but she was out of state, and it took a year and a half to jump through all the hoops. By that time, Sage had been through 3 or 6 different foster homes, several of which were badly neglectful. And she had learned, like a lot of children do in those situations, not even to cry, because even if she was hurting or she was upset, because she knew adults wouldn't come and wouldn't respond. So there was a lot of healing for this little girl to do when she was little, and she did very well. She became much happier. She was secure with her grandparents until puberty and COVID, which happened at the same time. Unfortunately for her, it was right during that same period. And so during that time, her mental health really took a turn for the worse. She was hospitalized at one point. She was very fragile going into high school, and also very small. She was maybe 100 pounds soaking wet. I mean, this is a young girl, and so she had told her parents that she was emo. A lot of her friends were that way. She dyed her hair, and they went along with the sort of the however she wanted to dress. But at school, she was saying that she was a boy. And so, because she thought that would be a way to fit in, she later told her mom that's why she did it. She just wanted to make friends. So the school went along, but she didn't want to tell her mom. And so the school went along with that. They kept it from her mother, new pronoun, new names. They sent her to the boys' bathroom and treated her like a boy. Well, that ended in the worst possible way, because she ended up being badly bullied. And this is all in a 2-week period when school began. Badly bullied. She ended up being assaulted in the boys' bathroom, and her parents still were not told what happened. On Monday is when the assault happened. The school found out there were reports flying around, different kids saying things. They pulled in the police without telling her parents. They met with her several times. And by Wednesday, they'd had one of these meetings, and Sage was so upset, they finally called her mother to come get her. They still didn't tell her what they had been doing. And so that evening, Michelle found a hall pass that fell out of Sage's backpack that had a different name on it. And that's when Sage said she had been going by a different name at school and identifying as a boy. So she and Michelle sat on the floor together. Sage, again, it was kind of poignant. Michelle says she was trying not to cry. It was almost like reliving the way she used to process trauma as a child, but terrified of all the bullying, threats of death, even to her parents, threats to her, threats of rape. And Michelle said, "We'll stay home. Don't go to school tomorrow. We'll sort this out." But it was like something had flipped, and Sage ran away that night. And then the worst possible things happened. She was caught by predators. She was trafficked across 2 state lines into Maryland. By the time the FBI found her at the home of a registered sex offender in Maryland, She was then taken in by a judge. She was held for them. Her parents were told to come get her. They drove, early in the morning through the night, their car all packed with her favorite stuffed animals and blankets to take her home. The court would not return Sage to her parents. And the reason was that
I can
an
just only
attorney
imagine.
assigned to her
Oh,
was claiming that they were abusing her based on misgendering. And so they didn't return her. So suddenly Michelle and her husband had to clear themselves of allegations of abuse, which ironically, Michelle was a court appointed special advocate. So she was already someone trained to help traumatized children in state care. She was the last person who would have, abused her child. But it took 2 months to clear from allegations. And so the judge ordered this tiny victim of sex trafficking, of horrible things, into the male quarters of a children's orphanage or state home in Maryland. So with a bunch of other delinquents, where she got shoved around again. And for 2 months she was there. She was exposed to street drugs. None of this they told Michelle. They mysteriously, Sage never received the letters that Michelle sent saying that she loved her and was fighting to get her back. The attorney that was appointed to Sage told her mother didn't want her anymore because she was now she was now a boy, and they would find her an affirming home in Maryland. And the attorney told her she didn't care if she did drugs, she didn't care about those other things, she just wanted to get the case all the way to the Supreme Court. So she seems to have wanted to build a whole case based on this misgendering abuse. So 2 months go on, and finally Sage runs away with the help of a teacher there. And she's caught once again. She runs away thinking she's meeting a 16-year-old online, and it was a predator. And this time she disappeared for 2 months in even worse conditions. And so finally, even though the authorities had told Michelle that it was very possible that Sage wasn't even in the country anymore, possibly not alive, they did find her in Texas, and she was returned to her mom. But the thing that's so striking about this, there's more to the story, and maybe one of the links we can include her story of record. What's so striking about it is every single person who was in an institution or a state system that was intended to protect her saw only gender and just precipitated the worst kind of abuse because of their willingness to only see gender. And it turns out by the end, it wasn't even something she wanted to stick with. By the end, she was there. There's no question in her mind that she wasn't a boy. So it's a that I ended up hearing of her story in 2022 and then documenting it, spending a couple months looking through records and doing interviews. And I documented that because I realized this is the story that should help people understand what these policies lead to. And we did a law to go along with it. I worked with the Family Foundation, which is your counterpart in Virginia, worked with the Family Foundation on a bill called Sage's Law that did two things. It would require parental notification, because that was the first domino. They kept their parents in the dark, and that led to everything else. And then a second part that said it is not abuse to raise a child in a manner consistent with their biology, which is mind-blowing that you have to say it's not abuse to raise a girl as a girl or a boy as a boy. But it was just that simple two-part bill. And it made it through the House. Dave LaRock was this wonderful family-friendly sort of defender of families in Virginia who presented it the first time around. We made it through the House, which was Republican, but Democrats in the Senate Education Committee scuttled it. And that includes somebody who would say they were a Christian who could have voted for it, and somebody else who's a leader in her church who could have voted for it. And so the opposition was led by a transgender delegate, the openly transgender delegate in Virginia, Danica Roem. So I think if it had made it to the Senate floor, it would have passed. So, but I trust we've gone back. It's coming back again this year. It'll keep being brought back, I think, until it passes. But those are.
It's just such a heartbreaking story. And when you shared it with me for the first time this summer, just righteous indignation. Like how in the world could this have happened? And also for it not to be nationally known that this is going on. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast episode, Christian parents, Christian grandparents, please listen up. Church leaders, school leaders, please listen up. This is not theoretical. This is happening. And you think, well, the Supreme Court will fix it. Well, we've tried that already. And that's just not the way the Supreme Court works. Generally, it's got to percolate in the lower courts for a time. Now, I think it was egregious enough the Supreme Court should have taken it for sure. That's why we appealed it up there. But they decided not to take it right now. Unfortunately, maybe there are other families that will go through this, and this will keep, I'm sure it will keep going up there. But other states, have passed very similar laws, and it's a very simple legal concept. If you can equate non-affirmation to abuse or neglect, you get the entire machinery of the child welfare process that comes down on parents. And something else that the parents should be aware of, and I don't want to be a fear mongerer here, but I do think we have to be realistic and know what's going on, is that the federal courts, just by virtue of it being kind of family law, this is a state policy issue that the federal courts are very reluctant to intervene in these sorts of things. And that's why it's so important for these state networks to work on this issue. But just again, to kind of let that sink in, this isn't theoretical, it's happening. The laws that are attempting to push back on this have actually failed. Like, really? Like, you're opposing simply saying that raising a child according to their biological sex is not abuse. Like, that's controversial. Yes, that's the issue. And it's not even quiet anymore. Like, the cat's out of the bag, folks. Like, they're opposing these laws for exactly the reasons that you've heard on this podcast today. So it's such a grievous thing. Again, these are our children. It's our responsibility. It's the church's responsibility to disciple them. And the state is way overstepping its bounds. So this is a heavy thing. What can be done? And you've already mentioned that a law has been proposed. So could you speak specifically what that law would do? And then also I talk a little bit into the child custody context, because you would have not only a child welfare case, but also if you have parents that are divorcing, and one parent is quote unquote affirming. We've talked about we need to get different language. We're kind of playing in somebody else's sandbox. But one parent is referring to the child according to their biological sex. The other one is not. And judges coming in and saying,
because you're not using their biological sex, then we're going to put custody in the other parent. So would you speak to what's being done in specifically the child custody situation too?
Sure. And I wanted to also give just a little bit broader context, because even though this is not a federal issue, and it is, as you said, a state issue, right now, California and Minnesota are the only two states that specifically define it that way, even though courts are in practice defining it that way in many states. And there's legislation coming down the pike that would broaden that. At a federal level, the Department of Justice is pouring millions of dollars into training for judges to have them affirm. So, and this is state judges, so they are pouring millions of dollars. There are grants that have been given to several different counties that they've been working on for years. And this has also been happening, it was already happening, we knew about it, but this is the Department of Justice funding it, training judges to affirm and to see not affirming as abuse. So just to give you an example of that application in Sage's case, her father was so emotional when they wouldn't give her back. Her father was in tears and was so taken aback by this whole new pronoun thing, he couldn't remember to use the new boy pronouns. And the judge actually threw him out of the court because he was so in tears to the point he couldn't remember the pronouns. I mean, there's a heartlessness and a cruelty that goes along with this. It's just, that's the part that I was struck over and over in Sage's story by how cruel this story was, how cruel these people enforcing this agenda were. There's just no explanation for it. It's like this blindness as to even how they're treating human beings, denying a victim, a young girl, putting a young girl who's been raped multiple times in a boys' home and telling her mother doesn't want her anymore. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me, actually. But so
if I could I want to jump in on that for a second. I'm sorry, I can't let it go.
Yeah.
But I'm just like, for the dads out there and the grandpas out there that would even say for him, he's just broken up and he did not have a religious objection to using those. But for the Christian that says, I can't in good conscience use that pronoun, Do you think the working fare any better? And so, uh, just, I, I'm trying to talk through this with folks. Like, people can't even conceive, like they would come for my kids. Like, I can't understand that. And so for a dad just to be understandably completely distraught and then to get kicked out of a courtroom like that, it just back to this kind of messianic complex here, is just kind of a further evidence of that. So sorry I interrupted you.
No,
That
no,
just
you're
speaks to
absolutely
me.
right.
Oh,
I'm so
yeah.
familiar with the story that but just even that's some of the cruelty piece of it that, because, and young girls that have been through this, there's plenty of documentation that shows how vulnerable they are to lies. And so then to be told that your mother doesn't want you, and meanwhile, the poor mother is fighting month after month to try to get her daughter back is just mind boggling. But, um, so the other piece that's happening at the federal level that's affecting the states very clearly is that the Biden administration passed a new rule for the Health and Human Services Department that governs foster care, adoption, and kinship care. So all
Mm.
told, that's more than 3 million kids in the US that are in some form of either kinship care, foster care, or adoption, or need a permanent home, of, forever family. And so this new rule that they finalized in April says that if a child identifies as LGBTQI plus, that's the infinite alphabet there, that they have to be placed in a home that's affirming. So there's not a workaround for religious families. There's not a workaround for religious organizations. If the child says they're LGBTQ, you have to place them in a family that will support them. Now, think about that, what that means for somebody who's in a situation like Sage, because there's a high association between gender confusion and dysphoria and past trauma and sexual assault. And at root, gender dysphoria is kind of it's a dissociative state. You're dissociating from your physical body, trying to dissociate from your physical body, which is a very common reaction for victims of assault. And so what this new rule does, it says only families that will further reinforce that dissociation may adopt or foster children. Now, this impacts a lot of people. 3 million kids is a lot of kids. And they will remove. I know a family that just went through an interview in Virginia, and they were asked by a social worker, would you affirm? And they said that they would support and love a child, but they wouldn't affirm a belief because they were Christians. They wouldn't affirm a belief that they're the opposite sex. And so, and they were told also then that the child could be taken away if they did have a child. That's my recollection, at least. That's blending several reports together, a family. So it's, so this new rule imposes on every state the requirement to do that. So there's a couple of things that need to be done in response. One, because that rule affects every state, states need to take action and define in law what abuse actually is. And as you know, we're working on helping states have the policy to be able to do that. So they need to define that, like Sage's Law did, and is still hoping to, that it's not abuse to raise a child according to the biology. And also that states should not be allowed to teach that or require anyone to believe that it's abuse to not affirm. And this, what people don't realize, if they're not buried in these things like I am, is that it is so pervasive, so much more pervasive than what people realize, because the institutions that are training social workers, the institutions that are training laws, continuing education modules, all these sorts of places, teachers, of course, they rise up. I have a friend who's a social worker in Fairfax, and it is just a given. It's not even a question in their minds that to not affirm is abusive, at the very least a sign of abuse, and very possibly outright abuse. So we're talking about people whose whole mindsets have been formed, and who are, generally speaking, those who are in charge of these various systems and educations. So it's almost like parents step into the twilight zone if something happens, and they think that they're up against, they think they might be in a system where you recognize the rationality of, okay, we're loving and providing for a child, they're going through a difficult period, of course there's going to be differences, but suddenly you're in this alternate zone where, because your child has said or been told, encouraged to think that they're, by friends or online, that they're the other gender, that suddenly that's the only thing that matters, and all these other ways in which you've cared for and loved and know the child That doesn't matter at all. A social worker who spent 5 minutes with the kids knows that you're abusive.
And I think, Laura, you mentioned in one of our conversations this concept of kind of covering all the exits. So again, once you're in the system and then you're trying to get out, and like all the exits are covered, and states are taking steps or have taken steps to say that if you're a licensed counselor, the only thing that you can do is affirm.
Right.
That also the foster placement has to be affirming. That the judges are trained in the same way. So and then an individual, often called a guardian ad litem, differing terms perhaps in differing states, they're trained in the same format. And then the school, is it supposed to tell you? And so I want listeners to understand, again, this is not, I'm raising an alarm. I don't want to cause outright fear. We trust God, but we have some major work to do because these exits are being closed pretty quickly. And you have a state like Minnesota, and I'll use the term. I'll go ahead and just use it. And that is, this is a legally justified kidnapping. I'll just use the term. Taking a kid,
deduction. Yeah.
yes, from a Christian home, because you do not agree with the state's ideology, taking them from your home, putting them in a place that will teach them contrary to your beliefs. I don't see it as anything else.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, so a
And it
couple of
happens
things
with custody too. You had mentioned that.
Yeah.
I didn't touch on that, but in custody cases, already in places like California and other places, they're awarding custody to the parent who will affirm the child, because there's this notion out there that that's somehow your authentic self, which is again the whole concept of an authentic self or an identity that is unrelated to your biology is purely metaphysical. There's no scientific evidence for it. In fact, there's a lot of scientific evidence that going down that path actually hurts a child. But it's a metaphysical concept, and yet all over the country, this is happening in terms of for custody disputes is one of them. Another area is that several states, there's about, I think 15 now, 15 or 16, counting DC, are what they call sanctuary states. So a child can be taken by an adult who's not a custodial adult, so not even the child's legal guardian. They can take them to one of these states, California, Washington, Oregon, Minnesota, several others, Colorado, and the state has passed a law saying they will refuse to obey subpoenas or to enforce subpoenas from another state if the child is there for the purpose of receiving gender affirming care, quote unquote. So it's actually encouraging children to run away and encouraging individuals to kidnap kids because they will be protected by these states like Minnesota or California that enforce it. And so it's both for abortions, and usually it's what's it called? Covered healthcare is the way that they frame it, which is again an Orwellian term because it's for either abortions or gender affirming care usually.
But
So
if I could just let that sink in for just a second, and maybe listeners were a little surprised when I used the term kidnapping or you use the term abduction, but I don't know what else to call this, because if this were like a general custody dispute between two parents, and one of the parents just took the kid and basically was like, all right, I'm going to get away from the court, I'm going to get away from the jurisdiction of the court, I'm going to just take that kid elsewhere. Like there can be charges of kidnapping, there can be severe ramifications in that civil suit between the parents. And here it's just like, no, we're going to just encourage it, not just say it's over, but like encourage it. So, these are very, very serious developments. And that's why, as you mentioned, state legislatures, especially if they're the vote, it's certainly time to step up and to do something here, to clarify the definition of abuse, to step in and say what happens in a custody situation as well. And so we've gone on a long time on these issues, but I wanted to bring what's going on to the audience. And so as we kind of come to a close, any last thoughts, anything perhaps that I hadn't asked about that you think listeners should know about before we kind of ask a concluding question?
I think one would be, depending on what state they live in, to be very aware of what the ages of consent for medical records are and for procedures for where parents need to have permission to access their children's records. In places like Colorado and California, Washington, Oregon, I think maybe Minnesota, it's as young as 12 in some of these states. So from that point on, your child can access care that you pay for, your insurance pays for, but they don't have to tell you about. And in some of those states, the child can actually run away for a while or forever to youth centers because the state views affirming a child's gender as, again, not doing that as abusive. So your child, you might not even be aware that in your state, the age of consent for children is so low. And even within systems that are not like that, parents need to be aware that doctors, especially younger doctors coming up through the ranks, social workers, teachers, judges are all being trained to think this way. So they need to be very aware that this is what they could bump up against and not be surprised in a way, but just be prepared and be aware. And as far as schools are concerned, I would encourage every parent to have a letter. There's several sites, you might have one as well, that provide a letter that you can give to the school saying that they're not permitted to use new pronouns or change a child's record or anything like that without consent. So that doesn't guarantee that they won't do it, but it does mean that you have some legal, you have a little bit more grounds if it comes to a lawsuit. And parents should also check their own schools to see if their schools are part of, have a secret gender transition policy. And they can do that at parentsdefendinged.com. I think it's Parents Defending Education is the name of the group. They have a list. It's not comprehensive because they keep adding to it, but it's a list of thousands and thousands of school districts across America, even in places you wouldn't expect, that have these policies of concealing from parents if their child has transitioned at school.
Yes, we'll definitely include a link there. And Laura, where can those listening find some of your work? I know you're over at the Federalist, but where else could people tune in? We'll have the link to Sage's Law and to the Sage's Story for sure. But anywhere else that listeners could find your work, because we need to be in tune to what's going on.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've written for the Fairfax Times, for the Federalist. Real Clear Politics has picked up a couple of the stories, especially on Sage and the one on child advocacy centers. Christian Post, and there probably will be some I'll be putting together, helping with some background for this whole concept of abuse. We're going to be putting up some model legislation on the Heritage website. And so, which may, by the time we're recording this now, so we're not quite there, but by the time the podcast goes live, it may even be there. So I would encourage states who want to protect their children in this way, and I can't imagine who wouldn't. Every Christian parent should be aware of this, and to go check the Heritage website, because there will be resources there too.
Yep. We'll definitely include those links, even if it's retroactively. We'll make sure it makes it into this podcast, because we'll plan on sharing this over time. And I can't leave the podcast episode without mentioning a little bit of that pastoral heart here. Of it just so emphasizes, winning your child's heart at a young age, instilling in them a biblical worldview, of having them in a location. I think this may have been the greatest billboard for Christian education that we've shared in a long time, of knowing where your kids are, but also especially as they head into those teenage years, 11 to 14, 14, that kind of magical age where the churches, the court's going to see it as they're saying that what is in their best interests, but just continuing to work with them, minister to them, because and you've got to plug that in at 5, 6, 7, 8, before you hit these years. And it's certainly not, for parents that have gone through something like this, not saying that they were bad parents, but certainly we should do everything that we can. And then I think church and school leaders need to be committed to, how do we partner with parents as they face this? I mean, this is probably coming to a congregation near you, or maybe even your own.
Definitely. So, well, and to pick up on that, I think this movement, the trans movement, picks on kids that are vulnerable and quirky and already a little bit on the outside. And so I think that part of what we need to do as churches is to be the kind of welcoming place and figure out how to reach kids that are on the fringes and make them feel like they're part of something. Because what the trans community offers is sudden celebration and love and celebrity status that for kids who have felt on the outs their whole life. And so suddenly they have meaning, they have a cause, they have an automatic enemy who's everybody who doesn't support this. And it gives a sense of identity and belonging that our churches may not have given. I have 5 kids. I still have kids in youth groups and from college to middle school. It's not always easy, but I think that's a piece of it. And to pick up on what you said, that I almost always, I would say 70% of the time, see 14 as the age when I hear a child pulled into this or a horror story. The child was 14. It's not that there's anything magical about that age, but it's that 11 to 14, 15-year-old period where they're so vulnerable and so uncomfortable in their own skin. I mean, I don't know anybody who enjoyed puberty, but but they're told that something's wrong with you if you're not, loving who you are when you're going through puberty. And so I think churches being aware and parents knowing this is the time, even if you I just say really focus in on the time spent, the love, the understanding, whether it's activities or pulling together friends, like just realize that 11 to 14-year-old, 15-year-old age is like the danger zone. So it's not that others aren't, and you have to lay the foundation before, but these kids need to be able to understand what's going on culturally, what the biblical framework is, what the science is. This has nothing to do with science, what reality is, and how to be prepared to answer the cultural pressures with truth.
Laura, this has been enlightening. I don't know that it's encouraging, but it's enlightening and it's needed. And that's why I wanted to have you on the podcast to raise the alarm, to help parents understand the growing threat in this very, very important area. So if you had a billboard on which to put a summary or a message to those Christians out there, church leaders that feel the need to let's raise our kids according to biblical beliefs, what would you put on it?
I mean, I would say take action to protect your children. And that means taking action to put policies in place by voting at the school board, local, county, state, national level for people that will protect your right to raise your child, not only according to their biology, but according to a knowledge of the truth. Because the other side is, there's a very determined attack on the other side.
Well, thank you for your work in the public square, on international religious freedom, and then in your own home, raising the next generation, and then raising awareness about this very critical issue. I'm so grateful just to kind of see the different storylines in your life and how God has prepared you for this moment. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation about how do we best protect parental rights right now.
Thank you, Josh. It's my privilege for sure. And it's great to be allies on this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for joining us.